Hello, this is Rose with Rose-Colored Movies, and today I'm going into King Arthur. Brr, 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 brr. Comparing the Disney movie of The Sword and the Stone to T.H. White's book from 1938. When people think about King Arthur, there's a tendency to dismiss the story as sort of scholastic and dull, like we feel expected to recite an essay about King Arthur's Round Table if anyone brings it up. I felt this myself on the initial approach to the story. What I realized, though, is that the story of King Arthur is foundational and is used as a basis for a lot of science fiction and fantasy. Star Wars and Harry Potter have characters and plot derived from Arthurian legend. You couldn't have Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, or Harry Potter and Dumbledore, without first having Arthur and Merlin. Recognition of this fact is obscured by the very nature of Arthurian pageantry. King Arthur is King Arthur, and there's a round table and castles. However, if you rename the character, call Arthur, say, Harry or Luke, for example, and add a bit of magic or the Force, suddenly it's a completely different thing. It becomes distinct from its origins. Today on Book vs. Movie, I'm going to go a bit deeper into The Sword and the Stone and how it has influenced the world of fiction. A long time ago, in a summer vacation far, far away, a younger version of myself read T.H. White's The Once and Future King and thought it was amazing. I loved the education of Arthur and the pathos of his position as he grew up. When I started my research on the movie, I vaguely recalled that the Disney movie was based on the first book of The Once and Future King, The Sword and the Stone. Turns out that's not completely true. T.H. White originally published the first 3 books of his Arthurian cycle separately, The Sword and the Stone in 1938, The Witch in the Wood in 1939, and The Ill-Made Knight in 1941. When he constructed the combined work for The Once and Future King in 1958, he took the extremely uncommon step of rewriting large sections of the first 2 books to include in the saga. The Disney movie was based on the original book for The Sword and the Stone from 1938. So if I wanted to do an actual book versus movie comparison, I had to find a copy of that book. Thankfully, they are not super rare, and I found a copy through the library. As an added bonus, the older version also has T.H. White's original illustrations. In The Sword and the Stone, T.H. White gives the young King Arthur the education he thought befitting of the grandest and most famous of the kings of England. Prior to embarking on a career as a full-time writer, White had been a teacher at a boys' school, where the boys were fascinated by White's menagerie of birds and beasts. The Sword and the Stone seems like a gift to his former pupils, the ideal syllabus. The story begins with the young Arthur chasing an escaped hawk with his friend and foster brother Kay to the edge of the forest. Kay turns back, but Arthur is determined to bring back the hawk and enters the forest. Arthur gets lost and spends the night sleeping under a tree. In the morning, he stumbles onto the cottage of the wizard Merlin, who invites him into breakfast. Here Arthur meets Merlin's companion, the owl Archimedes, amidst a clutter of wizardly paraphernalia, and sits to breakfast with magical dishes that serve him. Over breakfast, the wizard informs the young Arthur that he is to be the boy's tutor. Then they all go back to the castle, along with the hawk, which they had recaptured. Back at the castle, Merlin begins the education of the young Arthur, which consists mostly of turning the boy into different animals. He begins as a small fish, a perch in the castle moat. Merlin introduces Arthur to the king of the moat, a huge old pike who rules by the law of might. Quote, "There is only power," says the king. "Power is of the individual mind, but the mind's power alone is not enough. The power of strength decides everything in the end. Might is right." Later, Arthur and Kay end up back in the forest chasing after a stray arrow which had been stolen by a crow, when they end up taken prisoner by the witch Madame Mim. Mim is described in the book as a strikingly beautiful woman, with coal-black hair and a sly expression. The witch takes the 2 boys prisoner and threatens to eat them for dinner. They are saved from this fate by Merlin showing up and engaging Mim in a wizard's duel, in which they are allowed to change forms into other animals. Merlin wins the final shot when he turns into a bunch of diseases, and the boys are taken back home. Then Arthur observes a joust between 2 knights before his next transformation, where Merlin turns him into a hawk to sit with the other hawks for the night and listen to their conversation. Here the hawks impart on Arthur their philosophy of death, singing to him, "Life is blood, shed and offered." and timor mortis is me, or I am the fear of death. The hawks, like the pike in the moat, live by the rules of power. After this, Kay gets jealous of Merlin's exclusive tutelage of Arthur, and Arthur asks Merlin for an adventure for Kay. Merlin sends the boys back to the forest to meet Robin Hood and his merry men, where they must help save some captives taken by the witch Morgan Le Fay. After saving the captives, they fight a circle of wyverns and griffins outside Morgan's tower. Arthur shoots a wyvern and Kay shoots a griffin, and when the battle is over, the boys return home. Next in Arthur's education, he's turned into a snake and takes up a conversation with a small grass snake he meets. There's a bit here about the lovely language of snakes. And yes, I do think J.K. Rowling based Parseltongue on this passage in White. His friend the grass snake teaches Arthur history. He tells Arthur that his kind, the snakes, are very old. He says, "There is no history in me or you. We are individuals too small for our great sea to care for." He talks about his relatives, the dinosaurs, those that lived and those that died, and those that became the dragons that St. George unfortunately killed the last of. Then there is Christmas in the castle and a great boar hunt. For Arthur's next transformation, he is turned into an owl and given lessons in flight by Merlin's own Archimedes. As an owl, Arthur is then taken to meet the goddess of wisdom herself, Athena. Athena gifts Arthur with the dream of the trees, and Arthur is given the ability to understand the language of the trees. Time speeds up, and he speaks to them in their slow language. The oak talks about his strength, the ash about his flexibility. The trees then laugh and dance. And yes, I do think Tolkien borrowed this for Entish. He was writing The Lord of the Rings right when The Sword and the Stone came out, and I think it is quite likely that Tolkien was influenced by T.H. White. Athena also gives Arthur the dream of the stones, where time moves at 2 million years a second. Arthur watches the formation of the earth as it coalesces in space, then watches as the surface of the planet heaves and rolls, as seas form, and then plants. The stones say, "Hold fast," and "Hold," "Cohere." But over time, the stone splits and falls, mountains become pebbles, and pebbles become sand. Arthur's next adventure was to be taken by Merlin to the castle of the giant Galapus to rescue the giant's captives. Arthur and Merlin sneak invisibly around the giant's castle before rescuing his captives. And finally, the last animal Arthur is turned into is the badger. Arthur goes into the badger's cozy home, its set, where the badger has a rather charming common room with a fireplace, some portraits of other old badgers, and some nice chairs in front of the fire. Over a glass of punch, Badger tells Arthur his theory that man has dominion over the earth because of his ability to make tools, rather than the other evolutionary advantages like claws or wings. Then Kay is knighted, and King Uther Pendragon dies without an heir. A sword and an anvil on a stone appears in a churchyard, proclaiming that the person who pulls it out will be the next King of England, and a great tournament is called in London around the event of those attempting to pull the sword. Kay, Arthur, and the whole household goes to London for the event. There, Kay forgets his sword for the tournament at the inn and sends Arthur, now his squire, back to get it. The inn is completely locked up and empty due to the tournament, and Arthur sees the sword in the churchyard and grasps it out of desperation. Music is heard, and all his animal and tree friends appear around him to cheer him on as he pulls the sword from the stone. A surprised Arthur is declared King of England, and Merlin explains that Arthur is Uther Pendragon's true son, and that Merlin himself had taken the baby to Sir Ector to be raised in obscurity. The book ends with Arthur proclaimed for the first time as King Arthur. And that's the 1938 Sword in the Stone. If you, like me, had read The Once and Future King and had been confused about why the Disney movie had Madame Mim, reading this earlier form of the book was really satisfying because it cleared that up. The character of Madame Mim actually exists in the older book, and I really wanted to see how she in particular compared to the movie, as she's completely missing from The Once and Future King. Disney had acquired the rights for the book when it was first published, but didn't make the movie for A Sword in the Stone until 1963, 25 years after its publication, and after The Once and Future King had already been out for a couple of years. So I probably wasn't the only one who was confused about which version was being used for the movie. Just to add to the confusion, T.H. White published slightly different editions of the book for the US and the UK markets. The US edition has a scene that was completely different from the UK edition. So to sum up, there are 3 unique versions of The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White. The UK print from 1938, the US print from 1939, and the one from the Once and Future King from 1958. If you find a standalone copy of The Sword and the Stone from after 1958, it is almost certainly the version from The Once and Future King, with the exception of a 1993 reprint of the British version, which is a great illustrated copy that you can also find. For whatever reason, the Disney movie of The Sword and the Stone was on frequent rotation in my house as a kid. Watching it again felt like slipping into an old pair of slippers. I knew all the jokes and all the comedy bits, all the songs. It's a fun cartoon that I had enjoyed a lot as a kid. And the enjoyment of the movie still holds up now. It is still a good time. The movie has Arthur as the 12-year-old squire for a much, much older Kay. Unlike in the books, where they grew up together as brothers, in the movie, Kay looks to be at least a decade older, in his 20s. In addition, Arthur is kept like a kitchen servant in charge of scrubbing pots and pans, where in the book he's basically a lord of the castle, having been raised as Kay's adopted brother. Arthur meets Merlin after chasing a loose arrow from Kay, and is taken as Merlin's pupil. As his tutor, Merlin changes him into a fish, a squirrel, and a bird, but the transformations seem to have little purpose, aside from great musical numbers or comedy bits. Where White used the transformations to give the future king some objective on the world, and lessons about the nature of power in the animal kingdom, in Disney the transformations serve as the source for music and goofy hijinks. Really, the goofy hijinks are the whole point of the movie. The musical numbers by the Sherman Brothers, who later do the songs for Mary Poppins, are catchy, easy vaudevillian songs. Merlin packing was a particular favorite of mine. I always envied Merlin's ability to pack everything into his carpet bag. Merlin helping Arthur wash dishes is a great number too. As a fish, there's another great musical number, but the pike in the moat tries to eat Arthur rather than teach him. As a squirrel, there's a lady squirrel who takes an interest in young Arthur, and he has to explain that he's not actually a squirrel, but is actually a man. The cartoonish bits even include a wolf who is a very close copy of Wile E. Coyote, who is constantly trying to catch Arthur for a meal. When Arthur is turned into a bird, he's captured by Madame Mim, an old witch who threatens to destroy him, but Merlin shows up in time to rescue the boy by engaging in a wizarding duel with her, which looks like the book's version, and ends with Merlin turning into a germ and making Mim sick. When Arthur goes with Kay to London for the great tournament, Arthur pulls the sword and the stone, and a very surprised Arthur is again declared King of England. For me, the Disney movie The Sword and the Stone was just a fun cartoon, to be taken about as seriously as the Looney Tunes. It has to be enjoyed for the simple fun in which it was made. Trying to hold it up to its source material feels almost unfair. White had reasons for turning the young Arthur into each of these beasts. He was trying to teach a future King of England. In Disney, the education is almost trivial. The whole point for the transformations is almost lost. Also, when I read The Once and Future King as a teenager, I realized the Disney movie had to be based on the first book of the series, The Sword and the Stone, but this meant they left out the rest of the story. The story keeps going with Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot and Mordred. Just doing the first book felt like making a preview, but then skipping the rest of the movie. So for book versus movie, the book wins it by miles. T.H. White was one of the finest writers of the last century, and his books have aged really well. I have no problem recommending them to anybody. The Once and Future King is one of the best books I've ever read. The Disney movie is a lot of fun, and I can also recommend it, but not as serious art. It has all the gravitas of a Saturday morning cartoon. Side notes. T.H. White's Arthurian saga was his tribute to Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. White read Malory's book while he was writing full-time and had the time to really dig into his work. At times, the once and future king just paraphrases scenes from the Morte d'Arthur, and then at other times, it creates totally new, detailed scenes that are White's own creation. Arthur's childhood was just a few lines in Malory, but White makes an entire book for it in The Sword and the Stone. Then he does the same for Gawain and his brothers in Book 2. The history of King Arthur is kind of fascinating because, so far as anyone can tell, there was no such person. He is a made-up ideal and has been used as a blank canvas for 1,000 years, coming and going into and out of fashion from century to century, translated from earlier works and reformed as the current generation decides. White referenced Malory, who himself referenced the French works he was translating. The story itself bears traces of the old Germanic sagas. The Sword and the Stone itself seems a lot like the sword Gram from the Volsung saga, where a disguised Odin drives a sword into the central tree of a great hall. Quote, "So he drew his sword and smote it into the tree trunk so that it sank in up to the hilts, and all held back from greeting the man. Then he took up the word and said, 'Whoso draweth this sword from this stock shall have the same as a gift from me, and shall find in good sooth that never bare he better sword in hand than in this.' Now men stand up, and none would fain be the last to lay hand to the sword, for they deemed that he would have the best of it who might first touch it. So all the noblest went thereto first, and then the others, one after another, but none who came thereto might avail to pull it out, for in no wise would it come away howsoever they tugged. But now up comes Sigmund, King Volsung's son, and sets hand to the sword and pulls it from the stock." A short note about this business with Arthur being called Wart, because this drove me nuts in the Disney movie as a kid. It's explained in the first few pages of the book that everyone in the castle called him Wart because it rhymed with Art, short for Arthur. I can't make the rhyme work in my American accent, and for the sake of talking about the books together, I've refrained from using the nickname because I found it confusing. But it's supposed to denote Arthur's youth, when he had a slightly degrading nickname when he was still just a normal person before he became a king. About the various different versions of The Sword and the Stone, when White was trying to publish the first 4 books into the Once and Future King, there was also a completely rejected 5th book, the Book of Merlin, which the publisher refused to print with the first 4 as it was a bit preachy and didn't really fit with the other 4. White compromised by taking bits of the 5th book and inserted them into the Once and Future King. To do this, he cut out parts of the book to make way for the parts he most wanted to retain from the Book of Merlin. During World War II, White had become a true pacifist, arguing against war in general. This was not a popular opinion for the time, and really still isn't in this violence-hungry world. White's 5th book was published posthumously, so you can read the whole thing now and read his thoughts on the unnatural existence of war. His desire to retain the message led him to cut out Arthur's transformation into the snake and the owl, the scene with Madame Mim, and the scene with the giant Galapus, in favor of the transformation into the warlike ants and into the peaceful geese. Personally, I love all of the transformations, and as much effort as it took to find and read the whole unedited set of books, it was worth it to experience all of the animals. While Disney seemed unable to wield White's version of Arthur, J.K. Rowling and George Lucas had no difficulty seeing the genius of the story and adapting it to their own uses. For the moment, it's enough to point out the basic plot points of a wizard bringing a child to be raised by strangers who is fated to a bigger destiny, who is then taught by that same wizard. Rowling especially used White's 1938 Sword in the Stone as inspiration. From Mim's wizard duels, up to the houses of Hogwarts, to Snake's speech. George Lucas used the same setup for Luke Skywalker. Wizard brings baby to strangers, shows up later to teach kid when the child learns of his greater destiny. Lucas also used the familial elements of the Arthurian legend. Arthur's nemesis is Mordred, who is Arthur's unintended son with his then unknown half-sister Morgase. The script is flipped a bit in Star Wars, where Darth Vader steps into the role of Mordred and Luke Skywalker as Arthur. That crucial confrontation, when Luke finds out he's Darth's son, is just a reversal of Arthur finding out about Mordred. I have to wonder how Disney, who is the godfather of intellectual property, somehow owns the rights to so much of T.H. White's work, and can't find a way to make them into movies. They likely own the entire Once and Future King. No matter how many other studios release multi-movie epics like Harry Potter and Star Wars, Disney remains myopic to the fantasy epic sitting right in its lap. So on my way out, I invite you all to imagine the fantasy epic that the Once and Future King could be. Consider what the story of Arthur would look like in live action against a background of medieval castles and forests. Imagine scenes where Arthur has been transformed into a fish or a hawk. Then he pulls out the sword and becomes a king. I find it kind of funny that everyone else but Disney understands the storytelling gold in the story, the drama and the joy of watching Arthur become a man and grow up. If Disney ever figured it out, they could make something to rival The Lord of the Rings. But they probably never will. And this has been Rose-Colored Movies. Thanks for listening.